Good evening, everyone, and welcome to virtual Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. Tonight's talk, Borders of Home, featuring authors Esther Safran Foer and Keith Gessen in conversation with Stephanie Butnick, is co-presented with Jewish Book Council. We would like to thank the Rita J. and Stanley H. Kaplan Foundation, whose generous endowment support makes the Saul and Gladys Gortzman Lecture possible each year. I would also like to thank tonight's speakers and our incredible partners at Jewish Book Council for all of their efforts to make these programs available virtually. If you're new to the series, you can watch footage from our previous events on Jewish Book Council's YouTube page. Now I would like to welcome Naomi Firestone Titor, Executive Director of Jewish Book Council, to share a little bit more about tonight's program.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's virtual Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation, co-presented with the Jewish Museum. The Unpacking series is always one of the highlights of my year, and it feels more important than ever now to bring together individuals like Keith and Esther, who have written works about Jewish life, identity, and history for meaningful conversations about Jewish community, where it's been, where it is, and where it's going. We're so proud to produce this literary event, whether in the physical space or the virtual space. Jewish Book Council's mission is to enrich and educate the community through Jewish literature. In addition to public events like this one, JBC publishes reviews and essays, presents literary awards, produces book club resources, and much more. I'd also like to mention our new weekly lunchtime series called JBC Authors at the Table, where we feature an author of a new book for discussion on Zoom each week. I encourage you to join the conversation and find out more at jewishbookcouncil.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to very quickly thank the people and organizations that have made this evening possible: the Jewish Museum, and specifically Jenna Weiss, and our media sponsor, Tablet Magazine, the premier publication of Jewish news and ideas in the US. A very special thank you to the JBC team for all their hard work on the series, and I'm especially grateful to JBC's board of directors for their continued support of Jewish literature, ideas, and conversation. A few housekeeping notes before I pass the baton. The chat feature for this conversation has been turned off. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists or the JBC or museum team, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Also, please note that you can switch between gallery and speaker view on the top right of your Zoom screen. Finally, my colleague Simona will be adding links to the chat. She's already added a few, including links to purchase both of our wonderful authors' books, if you have not already done so. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator. Stephanie Butnick is the deputy editor of Tablet and a host of Unorthodox, the #1 Jewish podcast on iTunes. She is the author, along with her co-hosts, of the newest Jewish encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, and please enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you to the Jewish Book Council and the Jewish Museum, and to Jenna and Naomi and Mary for organizing this. As some of you know, we usually do the Unpacking the Book series at the Jewish Museum in a beautiful and grand hall. And tonight, I'm really excited to welcome you to my bedroom. So it feels fitting that tonight's theme is Borders of Home, since we're all home and there are no more borders. And we'll be exploring questions of identity, family, and home tonight with my wonderful guests, Keith Gessen and Esther Safran Foer. Keith Gessen's latest novel is A Terrible Country. He's a founding editor of N+1 and the editor of the novel All the Sad Young Literary Men, among a ton of other writing. He contributes to The New Yorker and the London Review of Books and teaches journalism at Columbia. He lives in New York with his wife and children. And Esther Safran Foer is the author. Oh, I forgot to show you their books. Hold on. Esther Safran Foer is the author of I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a post-Holocaust memoir. She was the CEO of Six and I, a center for arts, ideas, and religion in Washington, D.C., where she grew up and where she lives now with her husband, Bert. They are the parents of Franklin, Jonathan, and Joshua. None of them, I think, have ever written a book ever. And she's the grandparents of 6. So tonight, welcome, Esther and Keith. I'm so happy to have you with me.
Thank you.
Okay, here's how the night's gonna go. I'm gonna ask Keith and Esther a bunch of questions, and then we're gonna open up the floor to your questions. And you can submit them through the Q&A function. And I know we're all Zoom experts at this point, but you can find that under the More tab at the bottom of the page. Just click Q&A, and we'll see those questions as they roll in, and later on in the night, we'll get to them. So first I wanna check in. Esther, Keith, how are you doing in this very strange new world? And more specifically, where are you right now? Esther, wanna go first?
Okay, well, I'm home where I have been for months. I was hoping to be on a book tour, to be interacting with people, to getting human interaction and feedback. And I am now doing a virtual book tour. A lot of it right now in Europe, so I'm getting up very early in the morning. But I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and delighted that the Jewish Book Council and the Jewish Museum have created this kind of an opportunity.
Keith, hi.
Hi, I'm in Brooklyn, where we have been since this began with no childcare. I don't get out much, so seeing all these people who have come virtually for this event is very exciting.
Yeah, no pressure, but there are actually a lot of people here. I'm watching this attendee count go up. I'm actually going to close that so I don't have to see that. But the best part about doing these virtually is that we get to sort of see you writers in your natural habitat. So are we seeing you where these books were written?
Should I go first? No. This is actually my husband's office, which is a lot neater than mine. If you'd see my office, which is strewn with papers and 2 large bookshelves, one side are all Holocaust books, Holocaust memoirs, Holocaust histories, and the other side are art books. But it was a little too messy to invite you in. So you're invited into my husband's office.
And having read your book, I had like a visual of what your office looks like. So I mean, as much as I would have liked to see that, it does.
We can do that later.
Keith, what about you? Is this where A Terrible Country was written? In this very room?
Not in this very room. I tend to move around a fair amount as I write, just kind of physically. So, you know, I wrote a lot of it at the library at Pratt, which is just down the street here. The Pratt Institute has a beautiful library. And there used to be a cafe called Bedford Hill down the street here, which closed a couple of years ago, where I wrote a lot of the books. So we're in the vicinity.
So now that we're all sort of situated, we know where in your homes we all are. Let's start with like a vague and open-ended question that I know authors love to hear. What is your book about? Keith, you want to start and tell us a little bit about A Terrible Country, which I'll hold up for everyone to see it.
Sure. It's Terrible Country is about a guy named Andre Kaplan who has finished his PhD in Slavic studies and decides can't find a job on the academic market. Decides to agree to his older brother's offer to go back to Moscow, where they're from. Andre's now in New York, and take care of their grandmother, who is getting on in years, can no longer really take care of herself, and doesn't have anybody else to look after her. And Andre's intention when he goes is to kind of exploit the grandmother for her memories of Stalinist Russia, and to use that to write an academic article and improve his job prospects. As soon as he arrives, he sees that actually his grandmother not only cannot remember much about Stalinist Russia, she can't remember who he is. So that scheme is foiled, and then it's this sort of long process for him of figuring out, you know, what he can do for his grandmother. He's not particularly good at taking care of her, doesn't know how to be with her. And so the book is partly about him learning how to do that. And then him realizing at the same time that the kind of really interesting thing about her life, or the kind of thing that he didn't understand about her life when he was going over there, was that what has happened to her in the years after the Soviet Union collapsed. So it's a kind of discovery of the post-Soviet condition, of which his grandmother is a kind of a great example. And then he ends up he's sort of getting dragged or allowing himself to become part of a kind of a nascent political movement in Russia. And then all sorts of adventures ensue, and then he screws everything up at the end. But that's about the gist of it.
And Esther, your turn. Will you tell us about, I want you to know that we're still here, and tell us what is a post-Holocaust memoir?
Since we're post-Holocaust, I guess that's what it is. And I didn't live through the Holocaust. I'm the child of Holocaust survivors. And since we're here in the midst of book lovers, I can tell you that this is the unusual case where the reality comes from fiction. We grew up in a home with Holocaust survivors. My children grew up with their grandmother, hearing stories, the little bits of stories that she wanted to tell them. She was very selective. And the reason that this is art and fiction and then reality is that our middle son, Jonathan Foer, as his senior project when he was in college, he wanted to spend the summer in Prague. And in order to do that, he needed to figure out how to do a senior project. He went to Ukraine in search of the family that hid my father during the war. It's a family legend. We have this picture. We've all dreamed about finding these people and what would we do when we found them and how would we thank them and what would this mean. So in 2008, he went and he didn't find anything. But because he wrote a book, and because people were reading it, they would start calling me and tell me he got it all wrong. I can't believe he talked about our little village this way. It's such a beautiful place, and here's the real story. And during the course of the next couple of years in travels to Israel and Brazil, I started to follow up with people, and they would tell me bits of the story. And I started to put things together, that information that I didn't have to give Jonathan when he took his trip, which is why he didn't find anything. And so my book talks a bit about my parents, how they survived the war, what happened to their families. There's a bit of bearing witness of my relatives who were murdered. And then it's about my search for information, for finding this family that had hid my father. And not to give too much away, but very late in life, my mother just let slip the fact that my father had a first family, had a wife and a child who was killed, which I was totally taken aback by. I didn't know how to respond to it. That as an adult, you're telling me this now. And so part of the search was, and I searched databases, the Yad Vashem's database, all sorts of databases that I could find to see if I could find anything about this child. And I couldn't. So the book is about my family's background, but it's about my search, which involved ultimately going to Ukraine and finding much more than I had ever hoped for.
Well, we will definitely get to that tonight. Keith, your book is obviously a novel. I've noticed that someone has already asked the question that novelists hate being asked, which is how much of this is autobiographical. But I do want to talk about you a little bit. You know, like our protagonist, Andrei Kaplan, you were born in Moscow, right? And when did you move to America?
I was 6, so I moved in 1981.
And so where did you grow up in the States?
Outside of Boston, we we kind of traveled the Russian immigrant sort of journey in the Boston Russian immigrant journey, where you started in Brighton and then you moved to Brookline. And then eventually we moved to Newton, and that's kind of where I spent most of my childhood. And some Russians went even further west. They went to like Lincoln and Concord. But we stopped in Newton. That's as far as we went. So yeah, Newton, Massachusetts.
So I want to talk a little bit about names and the way we refer to things. Keith, in your book, we have Andrew or Andre or Andriushka. I think I'm definitely saying that wrong, which is what his grandmother calls him. His grandmother has a patronym that's identifiably Jewish. We also see Andre struggling whether to use the informal or formal you when he's speaking Russian, and just how to sort of address people. And then Esther, you know, everyone in the shtetls your parents were from had nicknames, which made your journey a lot harder. And so this idea of sort of like official names versus like street names, essentially, how people actually refer to each other. And then again, in your family, Esther, you know, in more recent generations, the naming of your grandchildren seems so significant. So I guess, could you guys talk both a little bit about the importance of names and what we name and why, and the official versus the unofficial for a bit? Esther, you want to get us started?
Okay, sure.
Everyone's so polite. There's no interrupting here.
So one of the things that was able to unlock my search, I was looking for people who knew my family, and I was looking for people who knew my father, Louis Safran. And people kept saying, no, they didn't recognize that name. And it wasn't until I was in Israel one day with a 95-year-old survivor who I showed a map to. And I said, well, this is where the survivors from this shtetl put a map together where everybody lived. Amazing. I don't know if it's 100% accurate, but it's close enough. And I said, well, this is where my grandmother lived. And this is where her sister-in-law lived. And he said, you know, now he says, what he said in Yiddish was, "Dus is a mainze." Now here's a story. And it turned out that he was married to my father's cousin. And he said, here he is, 95 years old in Haifa. And he says, but nobody knows. But he's telling this total stranger. But in the course of this, he says to me, you know, your father, label from Lisht. Well, he wasn't talking about Louis Safran. Lisht was another shtetl that my father lived in with his family. And that's how he was identified. And most of the people in these villages had nicknames, descriptive nicknames. And some of them are very, very funny. So that was it broke the code for me, because after that I was able to talk to other people and I knew what to ask for. And naming, you know, of course, there's a beautiful Jewish tradition, at least an Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, to name for the dead. And I talk in the book about that tradition and about our children and our grandchildren and who they're named for and how they carry with them the history of these people. They live a very different life and it's wonderful, but by that naming, they will understand where they came from.
I'll take a shot at it. I came from, when we came over in the late 70s, early 80s, all the Soviet immigrants renamed their children. They did not rename themselves, but almost everyone that I know, so my original name was Konstantin Kostya. That's still what I'm called in my family. It's what I'm called when I go over to Moscow. It's my Russian name, but my parents renamed me Keith. And when I was in college, I had a brief period of trying to rename myself, take my Russian name back and call myself Konstantin. And I just couldn't, I couldn't really stick with it. I had become Keith. And it's this kind of fascinating way in which, I think our parents, in doing that, part of what they were trying to say was like, we've arrived here in the US. And we're going to stay here. And we almost want to release you children from the kind of burden of being easily identifiable as Russians. And that's it's partly sort of, so Andre in the book, his American name is Andrew. And he spends a lot of time kind of wondering while he's back in Moscow, what his rights and what his kind of responsibilities are, right? He has access to Russia in a way that other Americans may not, because he has the language, and he has a family there, which is true to my experience as well. And at the same time, he's going over there from a position of what we would now call privilege, right? He is, even though as an American academic, he's a bit of a failure. From the Russian perspective, if things get really bad, he can always leave. And he's sort of constantly wrestling with, and I think, and this is very autobiographical as someone who has going to Russia for 25 years now and writing about it, and I'd say as a journalist, but also as a translator and as a novelist. This question of, and I think it's something that all people who write or work in foreign countries have to kind of wrestle with, is, what is my role here? What can I say? What stories can I tell? And ultimately, for Andre, it's particularly confusing because he is Russian, he is Jewish, and he does have very deep connections to Moscow. At the same time, in the end, I think he makes a mistake, and his mistake is thinking that that he can participate in Russian life in a way that Russians can, and that's part of what leads to the kind of unraveling at the end of the book.
So I also want to talk about this idea of like the official record versus the unofficial one. Esther, I want to ask when your birthday is and how many birth certificates you have and what they all say.
Clearly not enough birth certificates. I do have a birth certificate, and it says I was born September 8th, 1946 in Zingheim, Germany. I wasn't. It's not the right date. It's not the right city. It's not the right country. And I didn't know why. I knew when my real birthday was. I happened to have been born on Purim. It's not why I'm named Esther. I'm named for my two murdered grandmothers, Esther and Brucha. But I know that I was born on Purim, and I know that I was born in Łódź, Poland. But why would they create this falsification? And it wasn't really until writing this book and doing research that I understood why my father did this. And there were lots of false documents created. I don't know what it took for Keith's family to get into the US, but after the war, nobody wanted Jews. There were somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000 Jewish refugees. 6 million had been murdered, but there were these people left and they had nowhere to go, including the beautiful United States. And finally, Truman convinced Congress working with Congress, they passed the DP Immigration Act to admit displaced persons. It ended up, I think the first act allowed for 200,000 people to come in, displaced persons. Only 80,000 were Jews. It's been said that about 10,000 were Nazis. And the act was set up in such a way that you had to have been in Germany by December of 1945, which was really hard for Jews. Unless you'd been in a concentration camp and somehow survived, most of the Jews who had survived were in the East, and they hadn't yet made it back. My family hadn't. So if my parents had said that I was really born in Lodz, Poland in 1946, it was clear that they hadn't been in Germany in December of 45. And it was just one of many hurdles the Jews had to overcome in a world where nobody wanted them.
And so, Esther, early on in your book, you write, it has been said that Jews are an ahistorical people concerned more with memory than history. Could you explain what you mean by this? And then Keith, after that, can you just talk a little bit about the importance of memory in your book? You know, Andre going back to his homeland, his grandmother losing her memory, he's studying whatever modernity and Russia means, you know, just this idea of the way memory functions and really whose memory matters.
Yeah, and it wasn't until writing it that I started to really think about this and to think, I mean, what do we do? What does the Bible say over and over again? Remember, zakor, zikaron, remember. When we just passed Passover, we don't talk about the history of when the Jews left, on what dates and what happened. We visualize ourselves. We have to be leaving Egypt. That's the journey we take on Passover. And reading other Jewish sources put that together for me, the idea that we are a people, and I'm not the first person to say this, this is well known, certainly among scholars, that we're a people of memory, not history. And why is that important? And why is that important for me and my story? Because history is about the end of something. It's something that happened, that we studied, that happened back then. But memory is about moving forward, is about taking those stories and carrying them forward for generations. And when I wrote this book, I didn't know, I am not a writer, despite having raised a few. I'm not a comfortable writer, but I realized if I didn't tell this story, that my grandchildren and their grandchildren wouldn't have it. And I knew how important that was. So keeping that memory alive, that's what drove my writing process.
You know, Esther, you mentioned Passover and this idea of let my people go. That was also, you know, reused as a rallying cry in the movement to save Soviet Jewry. So I meant, you know, there are all of these sort of similar parallels in all of these stories.
Exactly. And we, every year at Passover, which is a really big deal in our house, and, you know, we do everything from turning a room into a tent to having the kids do all sorts of performances every year. And one year I realized my mother she died when she was almost 99. I realized we were coming to the end, and I had the kids all interview her and talk about her exodus, because I wanted them to hear that from her and for them to have that memory of having heard it from her. Of course, Keith's story is a different let my people go.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this in Russia, in Ukraine, in the sort of post-Soviet space, in Europe generally, after the Holocaust, you know, memory in the kind of public arena becomes this really interesting problem, right? So, you know, in something that's been happening sort of politically over the last 20 years, which has been very interesting to me, is the way in which Europe, as it's expanded to the east and into the former Soviet bloc, and you know, gradually into the former Soviet republics, there's been a kind of memory debate about the Holocaust and Stalinism. And one of the things that the Eastern European countries have argued, in my mind, sort of dangerously, is that these things are actually the same, right? Is that just as the Jews suffered during the Holocaust, so we Ukrainians, Estonians, Poles suffered under Stalin, and they did suffer. Yet the kind of the equivalence is problematic. Ukraine is a fascinating example where, and this is, Esther's book is about going back to Ukraine and sort of trying to uncover these memories or this history. Ukraine has this. It's one of the places where the Holocaust really happened, right? Ukraine, Poland, and Belarus. That's the kind of area where the Jews were, and it's where they died. In post-Soviet Ukraine, as Esther, as you talk a little bit about in the book, right? The Holocaust is not a big subject, inside that country, right? And one of the things that's happened is, in a kind of interesting, kind of historical, I don't know if it's an irony, but the Ukrainian diaspora in North America watched the rise of Holocaust remembrance in the United States in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and thought, well, actually, we have our own tragedy for our people, which was the famine in the 1930s. And one thing that's happened in Ukraine in the post-Soviet period is that kind of commemoration of that famine, the Golodomor, has been sort of re-imported from the diaspora back into Ukraine, and it's become a major sort of political rallying cry, a kind of one of the attempts by the Ukrainian kind of political class to forge a national identity around this event. One of the kind of problems with it is that some of the people who were carrying out the policies of the Stalinist regime, quite a few of them, in fact, in Ukraine were Jewish. So there's this kind of weird, very complicated argument, within Ukraine, partly, as a response to, also partly as a response to the reputation that Ukraine developed in the post-war period as a place that was unfriendly to Jews during the war, and as a place that, sent or offered people to work in the camps where the Jews were killed. And so a rather long answer before I actually get to what I was writing about in the book. For the grandmother in the book, who is, and people have asked this in the Q&A, who is based, the narrator is based very loosely on me, but the grandmother is really my grandmother. Her experience of the Soviet history was profoundly ambivalent. She hated the Soviet Union. She hated communism. At the same time, she was an intellectual, a translator. Her husband was a nuclear physicist. They lived in a research town outside of Moscow. They were rewarded for their kind of service to the Soviet regime, even as both of them really despised it. So that's very interesting to me. The other thing that's interesting to me, which is more what the book really talks about, it's the experience of a person, and this is the experience of a lot of people who hated the Soviet Union, was very happy when it fell apart, and yet who in the post-Soviet period really kind of lost, she lost her life savings. In the book, she loses her dacha. She her husband lost his job, but more than anything, she kind of lost her sense of herself in the world. So it's a person who, I was really happy that the Soviet Union fell apart and then had a really tough time after it did. And that's a kind of, I don't know if that's a lesson about memory, but it's an interesting story about how one's memories or even one's politics do not necessarily kind of translate into the sort of life one has.
So we're getting a ton of questions in, so I'm gonna like mush a bunch together and throw them at both of you. Esther, we'll start with you. Someone wants to know if your parents told you about their experience, if you felt like they kept stories from you, how your mother felt when you went back, and then generally what you found when you went back, and like what the hardest parts of that journey were.
I look forward to having them read the book. So they didn't, very classic in families of Holocaust survivors. There were lots of secrets. There were lots of things I was never told. I knew I couldn't even ask a lot of difficult questions. I had to maneuver around them. Going back, the hardest thing, I had planned this trip. I had hired researchers. I'd hired this FBI agent to study the photographs that I had and some photographs that had been sent to me from Ukraine, but I hadn't told my mother. And that was the hardest thing I had to do. And I knew it was going to be awful. And when I called her, this was the place where the worst things in the world could happen to somebody, and they happened to her family, all of whom were killed. Her mother, her sisters, her grandparents, her nieces. And finally, I just had to do it. So I called her and I said, I'm taking this trip to Ukraine. And I told her why I was going. It was a research trip. And she kind of almost yelled out, "How can you do this to me?" And I said, well, it's okay. I'm taking Frank, my oldest son. And she said, "You're taking your child? He has babies." And the next day, she always spoke with a heavy accent. She came from a little shtetl, but she was a very smart woman. She called me the next day and she said, "I want you to understand where my fear is coming from," because she knew I was going to do it anyway. And then finally, when I left, when I had to call her to say goodbye and we were going to board the plane, she said, "Take a good book, stay in your room, don't eat anything they give you, and don't do anything stupid." So, she was not thrilled that I was doing this. And even when I came back and I would show her pictures of where she lived, she'd look at them a little bit and then she'd push them away. And I just respected her needs, although I did go.
I just want to jump in. Esther, when I read that passage in your book, I was very struck by it because, so my grandmother is the same generation. She was born in 1920. When was your?
Exactly. My mother was born in 1920.
Yeah.
In fact, I read your book. I found all those similarities.
Right. So my grandmother, she was born in Bidiaslavl, which is a small town outside of Kiev, and they left for Moscow when she was little. But that was, the same thing happened there as happened in your mother's town. The Germans came and shot everyone, and they just happened to have escaped before that happened. And she would say to me, she would say, "Why are you coming here? I'm so glad you're here, but it's a terrible country. Please leave as soon as possible." And yet, of course, for her, it was different because she had spent her whole life there, right? So she had to say, she also thought it was a terrible country, right? And a place where all these awful things had happened, and yet it was kind of her terrible country, right? Yeah.
So for my mother, it was not her terrible country. First of all, I would ask her where she would, she told me she was born in Poland, which she was, but it was a part of the world that changed hands every 10 minutes. When I went, I had to go to Ukraine to visit the shtetl in Poland where she was born. But for her, there was no going back.
So Keith, a bunch of questions for you. Essentially, someone, we're asking about, someone saying that they read a lot of narratives of the children of Holocaust survivors, but not much about the experience of the children of Soviet Jews who grew up in the United States. What was that like? Was there alienation with your parents sort of being from a different world? And then we're getting a lot of the questions about Russia today, America today. Someone points out that A Terrible Country, the title of your book, does not necessarily only apply to Russia these days. I don't know. That's all. There's like 10 more that I'm not even putting in this one.
Yeah, I mean, my parents had, it was very interesting, their kind of relationship to the Soviet Union and to Russia, right? They, they came here and they were very happy that they did. And there were things about America that they loved, and yet they really remained connected to Russia in a ton of, and my mom, in particular, my mom was a literary critic, and mostly writing about Russian books, Soviet books. So she, in the US, was able to publish in emigre literary journals things that she could not publish back in Moscow. But everything that she was reading and all the writers that she cared about were writing in Russian, and most of them were still in Russia. And so, so on the one hand, the Soviet Union was this terrible place from which we had barely escaped. And in fact, when my sister and I started going back, my mom died when I was in high school, but my dad, I think, was part of him was sort of fascinated that we were doing this, but also I think he was kind of annoyed and frightened, and his position was kind of like, we got you out of there, why are you going back? And yet, so that was kind of one side of it, and on the other side of it was, so Russia is a terrible place, a terrible country from which we barely escaped. On the other hand, it is the kind of source of all light. All the great books are Russian, all the great music is Russian. If there's a movie from Russia, playing at Coolidge Corner, we all go and watch it. So it was a kind of profoundly ambivalent relationship to Russia, to the Jewish experience in Russia, that they kind of bequeathed to me, and frankly, which I continue to this day to kind of enact or feel. I mean, I still, every time I go back there, I think, oh, I don't know why I've come here again. What am I doing here? I gotta stop coming here. And then, a week later, I don't want to leave. I've become very comfortable. I don't want to come back here. And I don't see that stopping. I have now 2 young sons, and I spent some time thinking about it, but I started talking to them in Russian. Sort of, and I've some of my friends who, like me, were kids when they came over and kind of had a choice of whether to speak to their kids in Russian or not. And some of them have chosen not to, right? And kind of, they've decided to sever that connection once and for all. And I understand that, and in a way, I'm sort of envious of them. And I feel like I've kind of burdened to my children, and I can't help it. I want them to go through some of what I've gone through, and to have access to all the kind of the things that have been incredibly meaningful to me in my kind of reading, and being able to read Russian poetry in the original, to read Joseph Brodsky in the original, read Anna Akhmatova and Tsvetaeva in the original. So not just a burden, but also kind of a wonderful thing, I think.
So I want to end on one of my own questions because I'm running this and I get to choose what questions we ask. Esther, you write that the shtetl is gone and yet it still shapes my life. I mean, the same could be said for the Soviet Union, the concentration camps, the gulags, sort of the challenges and the places we came from. So I guess I want to get very deep and sort of say, as Jews, how do we reconcile who we are with, where we came from? I mean, are those even two separate things in your own lives and in your work? How do you feel about that? Who are we?
I don't think they're two separate things. I mean, Keith was talking about, when I talk about memory and passing stories on, Keith is talking about passing his Russian heritage on to his children. They're not two separate things. They're very much a part of who we are. I mean, we're in a very different place now, but we came from that place. And I have to say, writing this book, not as a writer, but just as a woman, a mother, was one of the most profound things I've done, because I was able to deal with a lot of issues that I had never dealt with. And I encourage everybody to do that, not necessarily to write a book, which is a long process, but to put their thoughts down, to figure out what memories and stories they want to pass on. I don't know if I answered your question, Stephanie, but there you go.
Oh yeah, the Jewish question. I find it tricky, and I think all of these histories and these memories can cut in different directions, right? Depending on how we want to talk about them and deploy them, right? So in the kind of American Jewish experience, the memory of oppression, the kind of the stories we tell on Passover about slavery, right? Those have sometimes been used in to say, well, our brothers here in America who have been enslaved, right? That is an experience that we understand, and we must work with them to change things, right? So the kind of Jewish presence in the freedom rides of the 1960s, I find incredibly inspiring and heartening. It has also sometimes been used to say, and this is James Baldwin wrote about this. It has also sometimes been used by Jews to say, we don't need to hear about your suffering. We have our own suffering, right? It has sometimes been a way of kind of shutting our ears to the suffering of others. I have found, in just the last couple of years, a revival of a kind of Jewish tradition that I find, incredibly exciting. We've had a Jewish presidential candidate who was also a Democratic Socialist. I thought that was amazing, and actually, a pretty old Jewish tradition going back to Russia, right? In the late 19th century. And there's now sort of a movement, partly inspired by Bernie, partly I think just a natural kind of reaction to some of the politics that we've seen in the last couple of generations of a kind of much more progressive or young Judaism, which is also willing to question what is happening in Israel. And that's pretty recent, and I think it's very exciting. So to me, it's again a kind of a story about memory and it being a very complicated and always sort of contested thing that we need to be vigilant, I guess, about.
Esther Safran Foer, Keith Gessen, this has been a real treat. You all can buy their books. There are a lot of you in here, so a lot of you can buy their books. They're in the links in the chat. You'll be emailed about them tomorrow. You heard it here first. They're both great. Highly recommend if you have some extra time to do some reading. Keith, Esther, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And thanks to the Jewish Book Council and for the Jewish Museum for letting the show go on, even though we are virtual, and we'll see you back here soon, hopefully.